He walked into the kitchen in the middle of the night just to get water. But what he saw stopped him in his tracks. His maid, who he thought was inconspicuous and quiet, was sitting at her school books. What he did next shocked her. Subscribe and write in the comments what city you're from. The estate of Richard Blake stood like a monument to wealth and silence. Nestled behind tall iron gates and manicured hedges, it was the kind of house that had ceased being a home a long time ago. The marble floors shone with such relentless perfection they reflected more light than they absorbed. Chandeliers hung in every room, some imported from Vienna, others inherited through generations, all glinting coldly under recessed lighting. Classical music sometimes played through the ceiling speakers, but even that, Rachmaninoff and Chopin, sounded more like an afterthought than an invitation. Nothing was out of place. Nothing lived here in the true sense of the word. Richard Blake, the man who owned the silence, moved through it like a shadow. He was a man of 62, trim, poised, with eyes that had once been called piercing, but now felt more like wells, deep, distant, and sealed. He wore tailored suits and spoke with precision, even when silence would suffice. Since his wife's passing, there had been no guests, no gatherings, no idle conversation. The estate was run efficiently by a staff that operated in near invisibility. Meals appeared on time. Rooms were cleaned with surgical precision. Fresh flowers, always white, were arranged in silver vases and replaced every third day without fail. It was Amara who arranged them. She was the housemaid, young, soft-spoken, and forgettable in the way that domestic workers are often trained to be. She moved like breath through the halls, never lingering, never speaking unless spoken to. Her uniform, though impeccably clean, was always just a little too big. Her hair was always tied back in a tight bun, and her eyes rarely met anyone's. To Richard, she had been no more than a piece of the estate's rhythm, another silent cog in the machine that ensured his life remained untouched by friction. Until the night he saw her studying. It was an accident. He had woken, as he often did, at 2:15 a.m., restless and dry-mouthed. The house was wrapped in darkness save for a thread of light slicing across the floor beneath the kitchen door. Unusual. The staff retired by 10, and no one ever entered the kitchen after that hour. Still in his robe, he descended the grand staircase barefoot, his movements slow, not out of caution, but habit. The hush of the house was sacred, and even he walked as if it might be broken. He expected to find a flickering light bulb, or perhaps the chef's assistant having forgotten to turn off the fridge light. But when he turned the corner and pushed open the kitchen door, he stopped mid-step. Amara was there, not cooking or cleaning, but sitting at the marble island. The stark overhead light cast a pale glow over the table strewn with thick textbooks, a spiral notebook filled with dense, slanted handwriting, and several sheets with diagrams sketched in black ink. She wore an oversized gray sweater over her uniform, the sleeves rolled to her elbows. A pencil was tucked behind her ear. Her head was bent low, her brow furrowed in concentration. Richard did not move. Something about the scene felt fragile. Her lips moved silently, repeating something from the page. Anatomical terms, he guessed. He could make out the titles on the spines of the books. Advanced Human Biology, Fundamentals of Organic Chemistry, Diagnostic Procedures. It was so incongruous, so absurd, that for a moment he wondered if he was still asleep. Amara, his maid, was studying medicine. He cleared his throat, not harshly, but enough to remind her the world existed outside of the page. She jumped, nearly knocking over a cup of tea. Her eyes darted up in shock and, for the first time, truly met his. They were dark brown, large and shining with the same startled intensity as a deer caught in headlights. I'm sorry, sir," she stammered, standing so quickly her stool scraped against the tile. I didn't think." He raised a hand, silencing her. "No," he said. "It's fine. I was just coming for water." She nodded too quickly. "Of course, sir, I'll leave." Again, he raised his hand. "You don't need to." A pause. He stepped toward the island, poured himself a glass from the chilled dispenser, then glanced at the open textbook. "What are you working on?" She hesitated, her hands knotting together in front of her. Then her eyes dropped to the floor. "An entrance exam," she said softly, "for an online pre-med program." He blinked. "I study after work," she continued, clearly unsure if she should. "I can't afford traditional classes, but if I pass this, I might qualify for a distance learning scholarship." He looked again at the books. None of them were new. Pages curled, margins filled with notes. There was even a diagram of a kidney, drawn carefully with colored pens. "You want to be a nurse?" he asked. Her head lifted slightly. There was something in her eyes now. Fire, not rebellion, but purpose. "A doctor," she said. He didn't respond. His mouth opened slightly, then closed. She stood, awkward and exposed, waiting for judgment, but none came. He simply nodded, set down his glass, and said, "Don't let me disturb you." He turned and walked back the way he came, but he paused in the hallway, staring at the sliver of light behind him. He had never truly seen her before. Not the girl who folded his shirts, wiped down his tables, and never asked for more than what was expected. Not the quiet figure who disappeared into the linen room and emerged hours later with everything pressed and perfect. He had seen a servant. And now, without warning, he had seen a soul. Back in his room, Richard did not return to bed. Instead, he stood at his window, watching the skeletal outlines of trees swaying in the night breeze. There was a stillness in his chest that he did not understand. Not discomfort, but something else. A stirring. The next morning, he asked the house manager casually how long Amara had been employed. "Almost 3 years, sir," came the reply. "She came highly recommended, reliable, never asks for anything, quiet. Family? None here. Sends money back to Louisiana, I believe." Richard nodded, said nothing more. But that night, and the one after, he couldn't help himself. At 2:15 a.m., he found himself pausing at the top of the stairs, listening, and each time he saw it. The glow under the kitchen door, the faint rustle of pages, the rhythm of someone fighting for something more. He began to notice her in the daylight, too. The way she handled fragile china like it was porcelain from her childhood. How she smiled, just slightly, when she saw sunlight hit the stained glass panel in the east hallway. How, even when no one watched, she treated every inch of the house as if it deserved care. He began to wonder about her dreams. Not the ones she dared to chase at night, but the ones she had as a child, the ones she perhaps never voiced aloud. He began to question things he had long held as truths, things he had inherited like wealth, attitudes, assumptions, blind spots. And so it began, not with a revelation, not with a transformation, but with a second glance. The kind of glance that, if allowed, could grow into something far more dangerous than curiosity. Recognition. That was where everything started. With a man who had everything and a girl who had nothing. And the light of a kitchen lamp piercing through glass walls. The next morning, Richard found himself seated at the far end of the breakfast table, his newspaper unfolded but unread, the coffee before him growing steadily colder. Across the sunlit room, the sound of polished shoes echoed faintly as the butler went about his usual routine, and the distant hum of a vacuum cleaner suggested that the day had begun just as it always did. Everything was in order, precisely as it should be. Yet the stillness, once comforting, had taken on a different edge, as though something fundamental had shifted beneath the marble floors and high ceilings. The silence was still there, but it no longer felt loyal. It felt heavy, watching. Richard tapped a finger against his cup and tried to return to the article before him. It was something about a real estate merger, the kind of business move he would have once analyzed with interest, but the words blurred into meaningless columns. His mind, despite every effort to the contrary, drifted back to the night before. The image of Amara, hunched over her books, her face lit by the kitchen lamp, concentration written in every line of her body. He told himself it was an anomaly, a curiosity, a private eccentricity he had stumbled upon and ought to forget. But he couldn't. The scene had rooted itself into his consciousness like a thorn, not because it disturbed the order of his house, but because it had cracked something in the order of his thinking. Later that morning, under the guise of routine oversight, he called for Mr. Denham, the house manager. Denham was punctual, composed, and deeply loyal, a man who understood the necessity of discretion as much as he understood flower rotations and payroll. "How long has the girl Amara been here?" Richard asked, as though the thought had occurred to him idly. Denham adjusted his glasses. 3 years and 2 months, sir." "She came to us from another estate?" "Yes, sir, a private residence in Connecticut. Before that, a few short-term positions, mostly live-in arrangements, always well-reviewed. She keeps to herself." "And her family?" Denham hesitated. "She sends most of her wages back home. Louisiana, I believe. I believe she has younger siblings. She never discusses them. She's exceptionally private." Richard nodded slowly. "And her behavior? You've never had complaints?" "Never, sir." Denham's answer was immediate, assured. "If I may say so, she's one of the most reliable we've had. Does her work impeccably, asks for nothing, avoids any form of conflict. We hardly know she's there." That last sentence struck Richard more sharply than he expected. We hardly know she's there. As though that were a virtue, as though invisibility were the ideal quality in a person. He dismissed Denham and returned to his office, but he couldn't escape the sense that he had just uncovered the edges of something long overlooked, an entire life that had unfolded beneath his roof, quiet as breath, steady as clockwork, and yet entirely unseen. That night, he paused at the top of the stairs again, this time not out of restlessness, but from something closer to intent. The hallway was dim, the grandfather clock ticking softly in the foyer below. The thread of light under the kitchen door was there again, pale and constant. He descended, slowly, carefully, uncertain of what he hoped to find, or what he would say if she noticed him. He did not enter the kitchen this time. He stood just outside the doorway where he could hear the gentle shuffle of pages, the scratch of pen against paper, and her voice, soft, almost inaudible, repeating a list of anatomical terms. There was determination in her tone, but also fatigue. Her vowels curled slightly, Louisiana twining around Latin, and yet the words were clear. He stood there longer than he meant to. Something about the intimacy of it, the private struggle, the sheer discipline of someone squeezing a dream into borrowed hours, left him oddly moved. He returned upstairs before she ever knew he had been there. The next day, he noticed more. It wasn't that Amara had changed. On the contrary, she behaved exactly as she always had. But now he saw her. He saw the way she gently nudged the door to avoid creaking it open, how she folded shirts with a precision born of ritual, not compulsion. He noticed the faded edges of her shoes, the way her fingers lingered over the piano keys when she dusted them, as if listening for an echo from another life. She hummed under her breath sometimes, just barely, a tune unfamiliar to him, but warm. It began to unsettle him. And then, one afternoon, he overheard her speaking quietly on the phone near the service entrance. He wasn't eavesdropping, at least not intentionally, but the door was ajar, and her voice, hushed and trembling, carried just enough. "No, I haven't told them. I can't lose a job, Mari. You know I can't. If I pass, then maybe. Just maybe. But if I fail, then what was it all for?" Silence. "I'm trying. I really am. Just pray for me. Please. I don't have much time." He walked away before she noticed him, a tightness curling in his chest. There was something unbearably intimate about hearing someone confess their fear to a voice on the other end of the line, especially when that fear was so layered in sacrifice. He didn't sleep that night. Instead, he opened his laptop and searched for the name of the pre-med program she had mentioned. It took him less than 10 minutes to find it. An online curriculum affiliated with a reputable state university. The entrance exam was a prerequisite. The tuition, once accepted, was modest by his standards, but steep for anyone earning minimum wage. There were no scholarships listed. He scrolled through pages of requirements, deadlines, student testimonials. He read the course list twice. Then he closed the browser and sat in the darkness, unsure of what he was doing or why he cared. The next few days passed in a strange haze. Business calls, financial reports, the quiet, frictionless slide of another privileged week. But beneath the surface of his routine, Richard felt the pressure building. He watched Amara more often now, watched the way she served breakfast, always without eating herself. Watched her slip out into the garden on Sundays and water the hedges long after anyone else would bother. Watched her fingertips brush the edges of the books on his shelves like a prayer. One evening, after dinner, he stood by the drawing-room window, scotch in hand, watching the sun burn into the horizon. Behind him, the house was quiet. The only sound came from the east wing, the sound of a vacuum cleaner stopping and starting again. Then silence. He thought of what his father would have said, that a man should never get involved in the affairs of his staff, that charity was a dangerous distraction, that kindness, unchecked, bred dependency, and yet all Richard could think about was a look in Amara's eyes that night in the kitchen. Not fear, not hope, but purpose. Undeniable, steady purpose. The following week, something changed. He saw her again in the hallway late at night, crouched by the laundry room, books sprawled across her knees. She didn't notice him until he cleared his throat gently so as not to frighten her. She looked up, startled but composed. "I didn't mean to." "It's all right," he said. "You're not in trouble." She nodded, unsure. "May I ask, what drives you?" he said, the words sounding foreign in his own mouth. She hesitated, then lifted her chin. "When I was 10, my father died in our home. There was no doctor in town. We couldn't afford the hospital. I sat beside him for hours. I kept apologizing. I swore I would never feel that helpless again." He said nothing. He didn't need to. In her voice he heard the echo of something long buried within himself, a grief so vast it had frozen him for years. He turned without a word, leaving her in the quiet. But that night, in the solitude of his office, he pulled out a sheet of paper and began to draft an inquiry. Not to her school, but to his lawyer. The beginnings of a scholarship fund. Anonymous, clean, irrefutable. He didn't know why he was doing it. Not really, but something inside him whispered that sometimes the smallest light could alter the shape of an entire room. And for the first time in years, he no longer feared the quiet. He welcomed it, because it was no longer empty. The morning after Richard sent the message to his lawyer, he awoke earlier than usual. The sky beyond the tall arched windows was still smeared with the last shadows of night, and the scent of brewing coffee had not yet filtered through the halls. Something in him felt restless, like a page half-turned. He rose, dressed in silence, and stepped into the quiet corridors of his estate, not yet sure what he intended to find or do. He had become attuned to the rhythms of the house in a way he had never cared to before. He knew, for instance, that Amara would be in the east corridor before 6, folding linen in the side room that connected to the greenhouse. When he found her there, she was bent over a basket of towels, hands moving with steady efficiency. The light from the window bathed her in a faint gold, and for a moment he simply stood there, watching. Not as a man surveying his employee, but as someone slowly unraveling a mystery long overlooked. Her back was straight, her eyes focused, her jaw tight with concentration. There was nothing languid in her movements. Everything she did held a quiet urgency, like she was always running out of time. She noticed him then and straightened, startled. He could see the flicker of apprehension in her eyes. She seemed to brace herself, though for what, he wasn't sure. "I hope I didn't disturb you," she said quickly, eyes downcast. "Not at all," Richard replied. He paused, then added, "I was walking." A silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable, but thick with something unsaid. He took a step closer, then gestured toward the linens. "You do this every morning." She nodded. "Before breakfast is set. The humidity in the greenhouse sometimes affects the linen room." Of course it did. He had never known that. In 3 decades of living in the estate, he had never once considered the effect of greenhouse humidity on stored linen. But she had. She saw the details, the things he had always missed. There was another pause. He cleared his throat. "Do you have a moment?" he asked, uncertain why the words came so gently. She looked confused, but nodded again. He led her through the glass door into the greenhouse. It was warm inside, the scent of damp soil and blooming jasmine surrounding them. Sunlight filtered in through the curved ceiling, painting the floor in shifting patterns. Richard gestured to a wrought iron bench beneath a hanging fern, and after a brief hesitation, she sat. He remained standing. "I've been thinking," he said slowly, "about what you told me, about your father." She looked up at him, eyes steady now. "I haven't told many people," she said. "I can see why," he replied. "It wasn't an easy thing to share." Amara shrugged lightly. "It's not about easy, it's about true." That word stayed with him. He sat across from her, resting his hands on his knees. For a long moment, he simply studied her face. There were lines of fatigue around her eyes, and her skin bore the quiet dullness of someone who slept too little and worked too much. But there was a light in her gaze that no amount of exhaustion could dull. "You want to be a doctor," he said. "Yes. Why not a nurse or a technician, something less demanding?" She tilted her head slightly, considering his question. When she answered, her voice was calm, certain. "Because I don't want to stop halfway." That answer settled in his chest like a weight. "You could have chosen something easier," he said. "I could have," she agreed. "But people die where I come from because there's no one to help. Not just to clean wounds or take vitals, but to decide, to act, I want to be the one who knows what to do." Richard was quiet. The wind shifted outside, brushing against the greenhouse panes. He looked away, suddenly aware of how cold his hands felt. "I never knew my wife had cancer," he said finally. "Not until it was too late." Amara didn't respond, but she didn't look away either. "She didn't tell me," he continued. "I was busy. Meetings, markets, acquisitions. I thought she was tired. Thought she'd recover. By the time I understood, there wasn't anything to be done." "I'm sorry," Amara said softly. He shook his head. "I think I was sorry too late." They sat in silence. Not the brittle silence of discomfort, but the rich, dense quiet that came when two people sat in the presence of shared truths. "I'm not telling you this to compare griefs," he added, "but I see something in you, something that reminds me of what I lost, or maybe of what I failed to see." Amara looked down, her hands resting in her lap. "Most people don't want to see," she said. "They'd rather assume." Her words weren't bitter, just honest. "You're not most people." The words were spoken before he could think better of them. She looked at him then, truly looked, and for the first time he realized how young she still was. Young, but with eyes that had already seen too much. "I should get back," she said, standing. He stood too. "Yes, of course." But as she reached for the door, he added, "If you ever need anything—" She paused. "I've already taken too much of your time." "No," he said more firmly than he meant. "You haven't." She nodded once, then slipped out the door and was gone. That night, Richard walked into his office and opened the file his lawyer had sent him. The legal framework for an anonymous scholarship fund was simple enough. The paperwork was drafted. All it needed was a name. He wrote one without thinking. The Grace Fund, after his wife. After her last act of teaching, the day before she collapsed in their kitchen. She had spent the morning tutoring a group of children at the community center, laughing even as the pain laced her breath. The fund would be managed at arm's length. He would not be listed. Amara would receive a letter from the university's extension program stating that an anonymous donor had covered her full tuition, including materials. A stipend would be included to cover incidental expenses. No connection would be traceable. He signed the paperwork and sent it off that night. A week passed. He said nothing. She said nothing. Life in the house resumed its rhythms. Breakfasts were served, carpets vacuumed, ledgers balanced. Richard read his newspaper again, but this time he saw more. Articles about healthcare deserts, about medical discrimination, about students like Amara who never made it through the gates of institutions designed to keep them out. Then, one evening, he saw the envelope. It was in the trash near the laundry room, accidentally unburied. He recognized the university's seal. The name on the letter was hers. He couldn't read the contents, but he didn't need to. That night, Amara lingered at the kitchen table longer than usual. Her books were open again, but her pen lay idle. She stared at the wall, her face unreadable. He watched her from the hallway, unseen. Then she reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded note. She unfolded it slowly, and for a moment just stared at the words. She smiled, a small, private smile. Then she returned to her book and began to write again, faster this time, more certain. Richard turned away. Back in his room, he sat on the edge of his bed and stared at the floor for a long time. He did not feel proud. He did not feel heroic. He felt useful. For the first time in years, he had done something that didn't benefit a board or a market. He had done something for a single person, and the world had not shifted beneath his feet. The earth had not ended. But the silence around him was different now. It had weight, shape. It was filled with the sound of a pencil scratching across paper, of pages turning, of a future being built one word at a time. And somewhere in the depths of that silence a single flame burned. It was not his, but it lit the house nonetheless. The acceptance letter arrived on a rainy Thursday. The sky above the estate had been draped in gray since morning, and the house was quieter than usual, as if the weather had seeped into its walls and dulled the edges of every sound. Amara had found the envelope tucked beneath the stack of folded towels in her cubby near the laundry chute. It had her name printed on it in neat block letters and bore the return address of the university. She stared at it for a moment, holding her breath, then retreated into her small room, closing the door behind her. She opened the letter sitting on the edge of her bed, her hands trembling slightly. The paper was thin, official, with the kind of ink that bled through on cheap stock, but she barely noticed. Her eyes skimmed the first paragraph once, then again. She was in. The program had accepted her. Tuition covered, materials included, a small monthly stipend provided through a third-party donor initiative. No names, just facts. She sat in stunned silence, letter in her lap, her mind both spinning and frozen. She had done it. After all the nights of studying, all the secret tests and rewritten essays, all the whispered vocabulary at 2 a.m, she had finally been seen. Chosen. But the euphoria was fleeting. A flicker of light that quickly gave way to the looming reality she had fought to ignore. To attend the program, even online, she would need time. Time to study, attend virtual labs, complete assignments. Time she currently spent scrubbing floors, organizing pantries, ironing sheets. Her stipend would not cover rent for her siblings back home, nor the medication her mother still needed. It wouldn't stretch to cover school fees for Mari or Ben. If she quit this job to make room for classes, the structure that supported her family would collapse. Her breath came shallow and quick as the weight of it pressed down on her chest. The walls of her small room seemed to close in. She folded the letter and placed it carefully in her drawer, beneath the old T-shirts she had brought from Louisiana. And for the rest of the day, she moved through her tasks like a ghost, present but distant, her heart pinned beneath a choice she had no luxury of making. That evening, Richard noticed the difference. He had come to rely on her presence in small, unspoken ways, the gentle order she brought to things, the quiet sense of progress in her movements. But tonight, she was mechanical, her answers short, her smile forced. There was a slump in her shoulders he hadn't seen before, a flicker of defeat in her eyes. Later, as he passed the staff corridor, he paused by her door. He could hear her pacing inside. Not the focused rhythm of someone thinking, but the restless shuffle of someone wrestling with something far larger than herself. He raised a hand to knock, then thought better of it. Instead, he turned and made his way to the greenhouse. He sat among the ferns and orchids, the faint scent of earth calming, but not enough to silence the gnawing in his gut. He had thought the hardest part would be giving her the chance. He hadn't considered she might refuse to take it. The next morning, Amara appeared at his study door. She had never come to him directly before, never sought his attention. When he looked up and saw her standing there, a thin manila envelope clutched in her hands, he knew before she spoke. "I'd like to speak with you, Mr. Blake," she said quietly. He rose and gestured toward the seating area by the window. The rain had stopped, but the light outside remained pale and uncertain. Amara sat on the edge of the chair, hands tight around the envelope. "I received an acceptance letter," she said, "from the university." He inclined his head. "That's wonderful." She nodded once, eyes fixed on a point just beyond his shoulder. "There's a scholarship," she continued, "anonymous donor, full tuition, monthly support." "I see." She hesitated, then looked directly at him for the first time. "Was it you?" The question hung in the air like a fragile glass. He considered lying, considered dodging, but the look in her eyes made such pretense seem insulting. "Yes," he said. "It was." Amara exhaled, not with relief but with something more complex. She leaned back slightly, her fingers loosening their grip on the envelope. "I'm grateful," she said after a pause. "Truly, but I don't think I can accept it." The words landed like a stone in his chest. "Why?" he asked, more sharply than intended. "Because it's not just about me," she said. "My family depends on me. If I take this chance, if I leave, even temporarily, they lose everything I help provide. You won't be gone. The program is online. But I won't be able to work the same hours. I won't be able to send the same amount. Rent's due every month. Medications cost what they cost. I can't be selfish." Richard stood, pacing slowly. He had never felt so helpless in the face of someone else's burden. His entire life had been about solutions, about buying time, access, power. But this wasn't a business problem. This was a human cost he couldn't absorb with a check. "What you call selfishness," he said finally, "I would call courage." She shook her head. "They need me more than the world needs another doctor." He turned and faced her, his voice quieter now. "Amara, you've spent your life giving, to your family, to this job, to a system that's never given you anything back. If you sacrifice your dream for survival, you'll keep surviving, but you'll never live." Her eyes glistened, but she didn't look away. "I'm not asking you to abandon them," he continued, "but maybe it's time someone else helped carry the weight." She sat frozen for a moment, then slowly placed the envelope on the table between them. "I've never heard anyone say that to me before," she whispered. "Not once." "I mean it." Silence pressed around them like fog. Finally, she lowered her head, eyes closing. "I don't know what to do," she admitted. "You do," he said gently. "You've just never had permission to believe it." She opened her eyes and looked at him again, as if seeing him not as a man above her, but beside her. Someone who understood more than she expected. They sat there for a long time, the envelope between them like a fragile bridge. At last she nodded, slowly, but with something solid in the motion. "I'll try," she said. "I don't know how, yet, but I'll try." A breath escaped him that he hadn't realized he was holding. He didn't reach for her hand. He didn't speak again. But the look they exchanged was enough, an agreement not written, not signed, but real. That night, Amara returned to her room and began to pack. Not in fear, but with determination. With trembling hands, she folded her uniforms, placed her textbooks in a borrowed satchel, and wrote a short letter to her siblings explaining that she was going to do something difficult, but that she would still be theirs, always. She taped a photo of them beside her bed, her mother, Mari, and Ben, and whispered a promise to the air. She was not walking away. She was stepping forward. In the coming days, the estate felt different. The staff noticed. The halls, once accustomed to her quiet presence, felt a little too still. Richard found himself standing in the kitchen late one night, staring at the empty stool by the island. He placed a cup of tea on the counter anyway, out of habit or hope, then left it untouched. The point of no return had come and passed, and though nothing around him had changed, everything inside him had. He had lived a life of acquisition, objects, properties, influence, but he had never before given someone a future. And now, having done so, he knew he could never go back to the version of himself who hadn't. He found himself checking the mailbox with anticipation, waiting for word. Any word, a postcard, a letter, something to tell him she had arrived, that the path he helped light was still open beneath her feet. One afternoon, it came. A white envelope, addressed in slanted handwriting. No return address, but he knew immediately who it was from. He took it into his study, closed the door, and opened it with care. Inside was a single page. I'm here. It's overwhelming. I feel like I've stepped into a world that doesn't know what to do with someone like me. But I'm still walking. Still trying. Thank you for giving me the space to begin. There was no signature. Just the letter. He placed it on his desk, then reached for a brass tack and pinned it to the corkboard above his bookshelf. The first of many, he hoped. And outside the rain began to fall again. Not heavy, but steady. Cleansing. The kind that didn't flood, but nourished. The kind that made things grow. Amara stepped off the city bus with a backpack slung over one shoulder and a folder of documents clutched tightly to her chest. The campus loomed ahead, not vast or grand, but unfamiliar enough to make her heart race. The sidewalks were damp from last night's rain, and students streamed around her in clumps, some laughing, others buried in their phones, all moving with the confidence of people who had always belonged in places like this. She hesitated at the edge of the main courtyard, then took a slow breath and stepped forward. No one looked at her. No one noticed the frayed cuffs of her sweater, or the scuffed shoes she had polished until her fingers hurt. No one saw the way her hand trembled as she pulled open the glass door to the science building and entered the world she had spent years reaching for. Her first day passed in a blur of instructions, digital logins, orientation packets, and names she couldn't remember. She said little, as she always had, and took notes furiously, hoping the sheer volume of her effort would be enough to make up for everything she lacked. Her classmates were younger, louder, many of them fresh from private schools with expensive laptops and monogrammed water bottles. They spoke about spring break and study abroad programs and shared professors' names with the kind of ease that suggested familiarity, not intimidation. Amara didn't speak unless asked. She arrived first to every session and left last, her notes already organized in color-coded tabs by the end of the first week. She kept to herself during group assignments, often carrying more than her share without complaint. In the evenings, she returned to the small apartment the university had helped her secure. Bare walls, second-hand furniture, a hot plate in the corner, and studied until her eyes burned. The stipend she received through the anonymous grant covered rent and groceries just enough. Every spare dollar she earned tutoring went to her family. Her mother's medications were no longer a monthly gamble. Mari and Ben had new school shoes for the first time in years. Her days became a rhythm of precision. Wake, study, attend lectures, take notes, work, study again. She built a routine from discipline, her mind a muscle she trained daily. Her dreams no longer arrived in sleep. They were lived minute by minute, carved from effort and silence. And still, doubt followed her. In the second month, a professor posed a complex case study in immunology, asking the class to diagnose a fictional patient with vague symptoms. The room fell quiet. Students flipped pages, brows furrowed. Amara listened, Then, cautiously, she raised her hand. "The symptoms align with a rare presentation of Jobs syndrome," she said, voice steady. "It's a variant of hyper-IgE, and we covered it in the supplemental reading last week." The professor blinked, then smiled. "Correct. Very well done." Heads turned. For the first time, someone asked her name. The shift was subtle but irreversible. They began to notice her, not with the condescension reserved for the outsider who tries too hard, but with curiosity. Who was she? Where had she studied before? How did she know so much? She never offered long answers. She simply continued. With quiet resolve, she moved through each day like a stone smoothed by water, not flashy, but unshakable. Back at the estate, Richard read her letters with increasing reverence. She still sent them by hand, folded notebook paper in simple white envelopes, never signed, never addressed personally. But he recognized her writing, the slight slant of her script, the way she dotted her I's with faint pressure. She wrote about the material they studied, about professors who challenged her, about classmates who assumed too much. She never complained. She wrote of triumphs with humility and failures with resolve, and always, at the bottom of the page, she ended with the same phrase: "I haven't forgotten why I started." Richard kept every letter. He had long since run out of space on the corkboard and had begun pinning them in a neat grid on the wall of his study. His staff asked no questions. His guests, few as they were, assumed they were memos or personal reflections. Only he knew the truth. They were evidence of something sacred, something real. In the absence of Amara's daily presence, the estate felt quieter. But it was no longer an empty quiet. It was the hush of growth, of slow and steady transformation. Richard had changed as well, incrementally, then significantly. He began to respond differently to people. He spoke less and listened more. He donated quietly to a community health initiative and volunteered as a mentor at a local business incubator for underrepresented youth. His name was never used. He declined interviews, but those who worked with him began to note the change. The man who once measured life by quarterly returns now found value in something that couldn't be graphed or filed. One crisp October afternoon, he received a new letter. This one came with a photocopy of an award certificate. Amara had been recognized for academic excellence in her program. It was unsigned, like always, but Richard recognized her voice in the modest description of the ceremony, the way she had stood at the back of the auditorium, unsure whether to go up until the professor called her name a second time. That evening, he framed the certificate and placed it beside her first letter. Later that week, she wrote about a mentorship program the university was forming, pairing advanced students with new international enrollees. She had applied. They had accepted her. She would be helping other students, many of them first generation, find their footing. Her words in that letter were different, still measured, but tinged with something else, confidence, perhaps, or the faint beginning of pride. "I didn't think I would have anything to offer," she wrote, "but maybe what I've carried can become a map for someone else." Richard read that line 3 times. He sat for a long time afterward, staring out the window, the letter still warm from his hands. Outside, the trees had begun to turn. The air was shifting. Even the estate, so constant in its symmetry, showed signs of change. The ivy on the walls had deepened to crimson. The roses had begun to wither, but the hydrangeas somehow had bloomed late. Weeks passed, then months. Amara continued to write. Each letter documented a small victory, a hard-won moment. She described the feeling of walking into a lecture hall and no longer questioning whether she belonged. She mentioned a classmate who had thanked her after a study session, not because she had helped, but because she had inspired. She wrote about walking past a mirror and, for the first time, not recognizing herself, not because she looked different, but because she stood taller. She didn't speak of arrogance. She didn't revel in praise. But Richard could see it, the shift, the quiet revolution unfolding within her. She was becoming, not just a student, not just a future doctor, but a woman who knew her worth. Richard never wrote back. He considered it more than once, but always decided against it. This was her space, her voice. To answer would make it about him, and it wasn't. But he showed his faith in other ways. Every few weeks, another anonymous donation arrived at the university fund, marked for general use but always large enough to expand the program's reach. A second stipend appeared for Amara under the guise of a supplemental award. A laptop was delivered to her dorm with a typed note, for long nights and harder questions. She never acknowledged the gifts directly, but in one letter she wrote, "Whoever you are, you keep reminding me that the world is not as indifferent as I thought. That maybe kindness is not weakness. That belief, given freely, can be the strongest medicine there is." Richard read that line aloud, his voice breaking slightly on the last word. He leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes, the letter pressed against his chest. The world, he realized, did not change through force. It changed through fireflies, small lights, quiet and persistent, flickering through darkness, showing others the way. And in Amara, he had seen the first spark. 4 years had passed since Amara had last walked the winding gravel path that led to the Blake estate. The air that day was clear and bright, with a sharpness only early spring could deliver. The ivy that once clung to the outer walls of the mansion was now fuller, thicker, and deeper in color. The house itself, pristine as always, stood like a monument to constancy, unmoved by time. But Amara had changed, and as she stepped out of the modest black sedan that had driven her from the train station, adjusting the blazer on her shoulders and holding a folder beneath her arm, she felt that change in every inch of her body. The estate looked exactly as she remembered it. The polished brass door handles gleamed in the sun. The garden hedges were trimmed to precision. The windows reflected the clouds like quiet mirrors, but the girl who used to mop these floors and press linens in the dim back corridors was no longer here. She had not disappeared exactly, but she had been transformed. 4 years of relentless study, of nights spent tracing human anatomy and rewriting case analyses of tests passed and doubts confronted, had carved someone new from the same bones. Her hand hovered over the doorbell for a moment longer than necessary. When she finally pressed it, the chime that rang out was the same one she had heard 100 times before, but now it sounded more like a call to something unfinished than an alarm. The door opened slowly. Richard stood in the doorway. He looked older, not drastically, but in the small ways time always reveals itself. His silver hair was slightly longer, and the lines around his eyes had deepened, but his posture remained as straight as ever, and his eyes, when they landed on her, were warm with recognition and something softer, something closer to quiet awe. She smiled. "Hello, Mr. Blake." He shook his head, a breath of laughter escaping him. "Not today." She laughed gently, lowering her eyes. "Hello, Richard." He stepped aside, holding the door open without ceremony. "Come in." She entered slowly, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor she had once polished on hands and knees. The hall was the same. The art, the furniture, the faint scent of wood polish and jasmine drifting in from the solarium. Yet everything felt new, not because the space had changed, but because she had. She no longer felt like a ghost walking through borrowed rooms. She walked like someone invited. They made their way down the hallway in silence. Not the strained kind, but the familiar one that had once settled between them during evenings of tea and quiet conversation. In the winter garden, sunlight streamed in through the glass, turning the ferns into lacework shadows on the floor. He poured her a cup of tea, not asking how she took it. She accepted it with a grateful nod. For a few minutes, they sat without speaking. Then he looked at her and said, "I kept all your letters." She turned to him, surprised. "All of them?" "They're still on the wall," he said, gesturing toward the corridor leading to his study. "When the house gets too quiet, I read them again." Her throat tightened. She hadn't known if he even read them, let alone kept them. "I didn't expect you to," she said softly. He smiled. "You once wrote that belief, given freely, is the strongest medicine. I believe that now more than ever." She looked out through the glass, watching the light shift on the orchids. "I've never thanked you properly," she said after a long pause, "for what you gave me, what you did for me." "You don't owe me thanks," he replied. "You did the work, you carried the weight, I just lit a path." She set her cup down, folding her hands in her lap. "But without that light," she said, "I might have stopped walking." He studied her for a long moment. "And now?" "Now I'm ready for what comes next." He leaned back slightly, as if allowing the moment to settle fully between them. "Tell me." So she did. She told him about her final exams, about the clinic rotations, about the residency interviews lined up across the country. She spoke of her peers, the ones who had become friends and allies, and the ones who had quietly sought her help behind closed doors. She described the hospital corridors, the patients whose hands she had held, the nights when sleep came in stolen fragments. Her voice was calm, assured. She no longer apologized for her ambition. She no longer questioned her place. He listened with the kind of attention rarely given in a world full of noise. His gaze did not drift. His hands remained folded. When she spoke of her first patient, a child whose asthma had gone untreated in a shelter until it became critical, his jaw tightened slightly, and she saw in his eyes the echo of something that had always been there beneath the surface. A man waking up, one small act at a time. When she had finished, they sat again in silence. This time it was heavier, not with sadness, but with fullness. He turned toward her, voice quieter now. "Do you ever regret it? Leaving?" She looked at him, then let her gaze move across the garden outside, the trees shifting in the breeze. "No," she said, "because on the way back, I found myself." He nodded, once, deeply, as if the words had filled in something he didn't know was missing. They remained like that until the sun had moved further west and the shadows in the garden began to stretch. When Amara rose to leave, he walked with her to the door. No part of the farewell felt final. Instead, it felt like a beginning disguised as an ending. As she stepped outside, she paused and turned. "I'm opening a clinic," she said. "Not a big one, just 5 rooms and a waiting bench, in Queens, for people who can't get seen anywhere else." He raised his brows slightly. "You'll need support." She smiled. "I have it." He inclined his head. Then the world just became a little better. She laughed softly, the sound like water in a quiet stream. "I'm not sure it's ready for me." "It will be," he said, "because you're ready for it." She stood there for a moment longer, then turned and walked down the gravel path. Her stride was calm, unhurried. She no longer needed to hurry. she no longer needed to prove. Back inside, Richard returned to his study. The light was golden now, slanting across the room. He looked at the letters, now faded slightly at the edges, the ink less sharp but no less true. He reached for the newest one, unfolded it, and reread the line she had added at the bottom. "I will not forget what brought me here. But I know, finally, where I am going." He tacked it to the wall and stepped back. The study was no longer a room of strategy and retreat. It had become a monument to quiet perseverance, to the sacred act of belief. He no longer thought of legacy in terms of empire or wealth. He thought of it in terms of stories, of people, of a girl who had once sat at his kitchen island under a flickering light and whispered terms of biology into the silence. And now she walked the world in a white coat, her name stitched in navy thread, her future built not on charity but on strength. Outside, the wind stirred the trees. Inside, Richard smiled. The house, unchanged in its bones, had become something else entirely, alive. The air in Queens was different, thicker, closer to the ground. It didn't roll in soft breezes like the fields around the Blake estate. It pressed in with a hum of traffic, the scent of hot pavement and corner food carts, the distant music bleeding from windows cracked just enough to let the day escape. This was a different world from the one Amara had left behind. Yet, in a way, it felt more like home than any place she had ever known. Here, life wasn't arranged for silence. It demanded to be heard. The clinic stood on a quiet block tucked between a shuttered laundromat and a row of aging townhouses. The building was nothing remarkable. A low, square structure of faded brick with mismatched windows and a roof patched too many times. But it had a soul, a heartbeat. Inside, the walls were freshly painted, the tiles scrubbed, the furniture modest but functional. 5 rooms, 1 waiting area, 1 dream. It had taken months. Permits, approvals, inspections, endless meetings with city officials, health boards, suppliers. Amara had spent her evenings drafting grant proposals, her nights poring over floor plans, and her weekends visiting donation warehouses, choosing second-hand exam tables and forgotten file cabinets. She had made deals, compromises, late-night phone calls with architects and contractors who never remembered her name. But she had never stopped. Every delay, every bureaucratic hurdle was met with the same quiet resolve that had carried her through medical school. She was no stranger to waiting, or to working harder than anyone else in the room. She called it the Humana Clinic. The name meant little to most, but to her it was everything, a nod to the Latin root for human, for compassion, for the belief that care should never be conditional. Above the reception desk hung a simple sign, "Everyone welcome." No questions asked. There was no brass plaque, no list of donors. The names that mattered weren't etched into stone. They were in the pages of notebooks, the scribbles of children in the waiting area, the whispered thank yous in Spanish, Bengali, Creole, and languages Amara had yet to learn but was already beginning to understand. Opening day was modest. No ribbon-cutting ceremony, no press. Just a trickle of patience. A mother with 2 coughing children, a man with swollen joints who hadn't seen a doctor in 5 years, a young woman too frightened to go to a hospital with her bleeding wound. They came hesitantly at first, suspicious of kindness that did not come with paperwork. But Amara greeted each one with the same calm focus, never asking how they could pay, only what they needed. Her staff was small. 2 nurses, both from the neighborhood, a part-time receptionist who was studying to become a social worker, and a retired general practitioner who volunteered 2 days a week. The rest of the time, Amara carried the weight herself. Intake, diagnosis, treatment, follow-up, paperwork, phone calls. She often stayed past midnight, long after the last patient had gone, organizing files, ordering supplies, writing notes by hand. She didn't mind. She had built something that mattered. And she was not alone. Though Richard never visited the clinic during operating hours, his presence was there, quietly, in the shadows of support. The medical equipment had been upgraded through anonymous donations. The rent was covered through a community grant that appeared just when they needed it most. A shipment of new pediatric vaccines arrived, prepaid and untraceable, 3 weeks before the city released its updated guidelines. Each time Amara received notice of a new funding stream, she smiled. She didn't ask questions. She knew. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the buildings and the last child left the exam room clutching a sticker and a lollipop, Amara stepped outside to the small bench by the entrance. The wall beside it was painted with a mural. Children in bright clothes holding hands beneath a blue sky, a tree in the center whose leaves were formed by painted fingerprints from the neighborhood. She sat in the fading light, her coat draped over her shoulders, and closed her eyes. Footsteps approached, not hurried, not uncertain. Steady. When she opened her eyes, Richard stood before her. He wore a simple coat, darker than usual, and looked thinner than when she'd last seen him, a bit more fragile in posture, but his eyes were as clear as ever, and they found hers without hesitation. She didn't rise. He sat beside her. They said nothing for several minutes. Around them, the city moved, cars rumbling past, voices rising and fading, the constant hum of distant life. But on that bench, time narrowed. "I was nearby," he said eventually, not as explanation, but as truth. "I figured," she replied. "I didn't want to come inside. It's your space." "It's ours," she said quietly. "You helped build it, whether you admit it or not." He gave a small nod, eyes fixed on the mural. "They think the building is magical," she added after a while. "The kids." He looked at her. "Is it?" She smiled. "In some ways, it's built on something stronger than brick." He didn't ask what. He didn't have to. He reached out, his hand weathered and warm, and closed it gently around hers. The gesture was soft, deliberate. No grand statement. Just stillness. But in his palm was everything she needed to know, that he had never stopped believing in her, never wanted recognition, never asked to be part of the story, only to help it unfold. She let her head rest lightly against his shoulder, their joined hands resting on the bench between them. The mural behind them glowed in the sunset. Children's laughter floated from a nearby window. The world continued around them, unaware, unbothered. But for that moment, in that place, everything had stilled. They had both been strangers once, she a girl with calloused hands and sleepless eyes. He a man hollowed by grief and habit. But somehow, through silence and small steps, they had found each other, and, in doing so, found themselves. Love had never been spoken between them, not in the conventional way. There had been no confessions, no promises, no declarations. Just a series of actions, quiet, constant, undeniable. And perhaps that was its truest form, not something said, but something lived. Later, when Richard rose to leave, she did not stop him. He pressed her hand once more, then turned toward the street. Before he disappeared, he looked back. "Keep the light on," he said. She nodded. "I always do." The next day, the clinic opened again. The waiting room filled before noon. A girl with a fever, a man with a chronic cough, a grandmother with swollen feet and no insurance. Amara moved from room to room with the same steady presence she had once brought to the marble floors of a mansion. Only now, the rooms held stories, not silence. Each day brought new faces, new needs. Each night, new exhaustion. But she did not falter, because she was not carrying it alone, and because every time she touched a stethoscope to a chest, or wrapped a wound, or whispered reassurance to a frightened parent, she felt it, that this was where she belonged. One evening, as she locked the door, she noticed something tucked behind the mailbox. A white envelope, no name, no stamp. Inside, a single sheet. You've made something beautiful. Thank you for showing me that kindness is never wasted. She smiled, folded the paper carefully, and placed it in her coat pocket. Later, it would join the others, tucked between her medical books and her license, a private archive of the journey. In her office, the walls were bare except for one photograph. It had been taken years ago, grainy and low resolution. A snapshot of a kitchen bathed in dim yellow light. A young woman sat at a table with a textbook open before her, a pencil behind her ear, her head bent low. She had not known anyone was watching. Now, that same woman stood beneath her own sign, her white coat crisp, her eyes clear, her hands steady. Not every story ends with love. Some stories begin with it, and simply grow. The house where it all began still stood, far away, behind iron gates and flowering vines. But in this new place, built from purpose and gentleness, the spirit of that house had found a new shape. Not in marble, not in silence, but in laughter, medicine, and light. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more. Check out the next video and explore the rest of the channel. And if you know someone who needs to hear this, share it with them.